Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. So good to see all of you this morning, particularly if you're visiting with us. We thank you for being here. It's always a blessing to us when you come our way. Hope you can make it back every time you have the chance. Let me add one quick announcement to those that were made. I forgot to tell Miss Janice to put this in for today. But the youth devotional will be next Sunday evening, and that will be at our house immediately following evening services. And we'll do finger foods and desserts, so just that'll be the standard fare. So for all of our young people and parents, go and mark that on your calendars. Next Sunday, November the 8th, immediately following evening services at our house, and we'll have our monthly devotional then. We're moving into a busy period of the year. I mentioned this to the daytime Bible class. I don't know if it was this week or a few weeks ago, but November and December are always busy, both with family events and congregational events. And I like it that way. I like it when we're busy. And I hope that you do too. So be paying particular attention to the announcements over the next couple of months about things that are coming up and good works we're going to be involved in and get-togethers we're going to be able to have. And I hope that everybody's able to participate in all of that as much as you can. This morning, ask yourself, what is your greatest pursuit in life? Of all the many things that you want to accomplish, that you want to achieve, that you're striving for every single day, what ranks at the top of the list? Your greatest pursuit, your greatest hope, your greatest aspiration? I dare say that the response of many, not necessarily many here, but if we were to ask that question on a broader scale, that the answer that many people would give would probably reflect some kind of desire or hope or pursuit of financial stability. It might reflect a desire to gain some degree of prestige, either on a local level or on a wider level than that. It may have to do with some type of particular possession. I mean, Halloween's over, and so it's already the Christmas season. Forget about Thanksgiving. I'm waiting for this afternoon to get on Facebook and see the pictures of people who already have the trees up, right? We're moving into that time of the year, and so what's on a lot of people's minds may be, what possession I would like to have, what thing have I seen advertised or seen in the store that I would like to have the most this year. That might be what somebody's greatest pursuit at this time is. But you know, it's interesting that you look at the many things that we could pursue in life, that we could set as our greatest hope, as our greatest aspiration. And you look back to books like the book of Ecclesiastes, and you see the narrative that Solomon goes through in him pursuing that meaning of life, and how he experimented with so many different things trying to find what it is that would bring him fulfillment. And he tested the waters of wealth. I mean, he was the wealthiest man who's ever lived. And yet, even in all of the wealth, all of the money that he had, he still couldn't find any fulfillment. Prestige. He was the king of Israel, the mightiest group of people in the world at that time. It had greatly expanded under his father David, and Solomon as king would reap the benefits of that outward expansion. And yet, even as king, even as the single most prestigious individual in all of the land, and really in some respects in all of the world, people would come from far and wide just to be in Solomon's presence, just to sit down and talk to him for a little period of time. And yet even in all of that prestige, he couldn't find fulfillment. Possession. What existed that Solomon could not obtain? And yet even in that, he still came to the conclusion, it's all vanity. It's all worthless in the long run. And it was not until Solomon tested the waters of total and complete submission to the God of heaven that he finally found what he knew to be the true purpose of life. When he made God the entirety of his life is when he knew that he had finally arrived. Now, if you wanted to see that same discussion in the New Testament, all you have to do is go to Colossians chapter 3. Because in Colossians 3 verses 1 through 4, you see Paul address the purpose of our lives in much the same way. Look beginning in verse 1. He said, "If then ye were raised together with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. For you died spiritually." That old man of sin, we talked about this a few weeks ago. That old man of sin died. He was put away. "And your life is hid with God, with Christ in God. So that when Christ, who is your life, shall be manifested, then shall ye also with Him be manifested in glory." You know, you look at those 4 verses and the way that Paul addressed Christianity, what the epitome of Christianity is all about. Paul said the Christian's greatest pursuit, his greatest hope, his greatest aspiration is not found on anything here. It has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with prestige. It has nothing to do with possession or anything else that we could possibly obtain. It is found, he said, by seeking the things that are above, by setting our minds on things that are above and making Christ our lives. Now, I want to notice, number one, what Paul did not say in this passage. Notice that in Colossians 3, Paul did not say that Christ was to be the most important thing in the Christian's life. Now that might sound weird to you. What do you mean Paul didn't say that Christ is the most important thing in the Christian's life? I mean this. To refer to Christ as the most important thing in an individual's life, in some respects, is to itemize Him on the level of other things. It's to bring Him down on the same level as other things that we could seek in our lives, making them of the same degree of importance, possible importance, as He is. And so in Colossians 3, Paul didn't just say, Christ is to be the most important thing in your life. He actually took it a step further. And in his mind acted to those as though there was nothing else in the world that's even a possibility of being the most important thing in our lives. Therefore, Christ is not just the most important thing in our lives, He is our life. I love that. I love the way that Paul talked about that level of spirituality to which we've got to strive every day, not just to rank Christ above everything else, but to put everything else to the side in view of Christ being the entirety of our lives. Isn't that the level of spirituality that you want to obtain? That's the level of spirituality I want to obtain. To get to the point in my life when I can say, Christ is not just the most important thing in my life. It's not just that I rank Christ above this, and I rank Christ above this, and I rank Christ above this, but that I get to the point to where I can say, nothing else even exists in the side mirror when it comes to setting my eyes on Christ. He is it. He is the entirety. He is my life. But if that is the level of spirituality to which we are striving, that's what we want to obtain, how can we know when we get there? Or another way of asking it might be, how can I know if Christ is my life? Today I want to talk about 4 ways. We'll talk about 2 this morning and 2 tonight. 4 ways that we can know by simple examination, self-examination, 4 ways that we can know if we have truly made Christ our lives. Not just the most important thing in our lives, but that He is our life. The first thing we want to talk about this morning is that by examining yourself, by examining myself, can I say, beyond the shadow of any doubt, that Christ is my life because I will suffer for Him. I will suffer for Him, and I won't think twice about it. I will suffer for Him, and the convenience and the comfort that I could otherwise have will not even be secondary in my mind. I will suffer for Him, and I will rejoice in it. When Peter wrote to those early Christians, and if you've been in the auditorium on Wednesday nights, not in the last few weeks, but throughout the majority of the year, you remember that we talked about 1st and 2nd Peter, and we really emphasized the background behind what those early Christians were experiencing, and how what Peter wrote to them, what it meant in the context of what they'd been experiencing. Because he was writing to a group of people, he said in 1 Peter 4:12, who were experiencing a fiery trial. They were enduring hardship that, to be honest, you and I could not possibly comprehend. And we spent some time talking about that in here. The immense persecution that had been brought down upon them at the hands of Nero and the Roman government. A persecution that was so intense that when they woke up every morning, they didn't know if they were going to be able to pillow their head that night. Because they could just as easily die before the night came as they could actually be able to go to bed. It was bad. But when Peter wrote to those Christians in 1 Peter 4, verses 12 and 13, among many things that he tried to do for them, he wrote to reassure them of some things. And in verses 12 and 13, he reassured them with these words, "Think it not strange concerning the fiery trial among you, which cometh upon you to prove you, as though a strange thing is happening unto you, but inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, rejoice. Rejoice that at the revelation of His glory also ye may rejoice with exceeding joy." What were they suffering? Unimaginable horrors. But even in the intensity of what they were having to experience, Peter didn't look at their sufferings as something to mourn. He didn't look at what they were experiencing as something for which he should weep. But instead he wrote to them and he said, "I'll look at your suffering as something in which you can rejoice. Because in your suffering for Christ, you become partakers in the suffering of Christ. You experience on a smaller scale exactly what He had to experience in order to provide you and me with redemption." And you know, Peter he didn't say that as an armchair Christian who had never faced the fire himself. Peter wrote that from someone who had personal experience in the exact same trials, in the exact same hardship. You remember the number of times throughout the early chapters of the book of Acts, before the narrative really shifts to concentrate more on Paul and his work, that in those early chapters, right after the church was established, in Acts chapter 3 and 4 and 5, that you see those apostles, among whom was Peter, And really at the forefront was Peter, enduring hardship in ways that you and I, again, couldn't imagine. Acts chapter 5. You remember that the apostles had yet again been arrested. They'd been imprisoned. They'd been brought before the council. They'd been publicly rebuked. They'd been beaten. And then they were charged with going and ceasing and desisting with what they had been doing, with preaching the name of Jesus. The council said, you better not do it anymore. But even after all of that, you come to Acts 5, 41 and 42, and it says that after all of that, after they'd been arrested, after they'd been in prison, after they'd been brought before the council, publicly humiliated and rebuked, beaten, and threatened to not engage in their activities anymore, that they departed from the presence of the council. And what did they do? Did they sit back in the shadows? Did they fear for their lives and allow that fear to consume them to such an extent that they didn't go out and preach and teach anymore? No, it says in verse 41 that they departed the presence of the council and they rejoiced. They rejoiced. Why? You've just been arrested. You were imprisoned. You were brought before the Sanhedrin council. You were beaten and you were threatened with your own life. Why are you rejoicing? They rejoiced that they could be counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name of Christ. And what did they allow that joy in their suffering to do? It empowered them, it motivated them, verse 42, to every day. Not once in a blue moon, not just when they felt like it. Every single day they went to the temple, they went to people's homes, and they ceased not to teach and to preach Jesus as the Christ. They opened their lives to scrutiny, happy, rejoicing in their ability to suffer for the cause of Jesus. And you know that principle has not changed. The principle of suffering for Christ has not changed. Christianity will by default result in our own personal mistreatment. It will. If we're doing it right, it will. Somehow and in some way, if we are truly living Christianity, if we have truly made Christ our lives, we will suffer. It is inevitable. 2 Timothy 3:12, you remember that Paul reminded Timothy of that fact, that all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And with that in mind, let's ask ourselves this question. What does the world's reaction to my life say about my life? What does the world's reaction to my life say about my life? Because if the world does not challenge me, if the world in their worldliness does not hate me, if the world in its own worldliness and unrighteousness does not mistreat me, what does that say about the way I'm doing Christianity? If I am comfortable in my Christianity, then maybe I haven't truly made Christ my life. Jesus made humanity His life through His suffering, through what He endured on the cross. He displayed the level of allegiance that He had for us in what He was willing to suffer. And He wants the same to be said of us in view of Him. To what level is your allegiance to Jesus Christ? It will be shown in how much we are willing to suffer for Him. Because if we have made Christ our life, it is not going to be a question of whether or not we will suffer. It will be a question of how much and when, because we've made Him our life. And so number one, if Christ is my life, I'm going to know it. It's not going to be a question to me, because I'll know it by my suffering for Him. My suffering for Him in the same way that He suffered for me. Number two, if I have made Christ my life, it's not only going to be evident in the way that I suffer for Him, but it's going to be evident in the way that I serve with Him. There's absolutely no doubt when you read about the life of Jesus that in His life He was all about serving the needs of others. Last week we talked about on a Sunday morning from John chapter 13 and the way that He displayed His willingness to serve by bowing before His own disciples and washing their feet. But you see that same spirit of service displayed in His life and said about His life throughout the New Testament and even in the Old Testament. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7, for instance, you see Paul speak of the fact that Christ came in the form of a servant. Yes, He was the Son of God. Yes, He was of the same nature as God. Yes, He was equal to God, but He voluntarily became the servant of man. In Isaiah 42:1, Isaiah prophesied of the coming Messiah as being God's servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delighteth. In Mark 10 and verse 45, Jesus said of Himself that He was the Son of Man who came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give His life a ransom for many. He was sent and came not to be ministered to as a monarch, but to minister unto others as the Messiah. And so in Jesus' service, He provided humanity, yes, with redemption, the greatest accomplishment that you see displayed on the cross. But He didn't just offer to humanity redemption through His service, but He offered to us a picture-perfect example of what He expects from our lives in serving alongside Him. Because when we truly make Jesus our life, His Lordship in our lives will be expressed in the way that we respond to His service, to the servant leadership that He displayed, meaning that we too will choose to serve others. I will choose to serve you, we all will choose to serve each other and all of those around us. Jesus counseled His disciples in Mark 9 and verse 35 that if any man would be first, what would it require? If any man will be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. In 1 Peter 5:5, all Christians were charged to gird themselves with humility and to serve one another. For God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. And then there's the statement in 1 Corinthians 4:1. I love the way that Paul worded this. A statement that he made to those Corinthian Christians about how they were to be made known among their fellow man. And he said in that passage, 1 Corinthians 4:1, let a man so account of us. In other words, Paul's saying when people talk about you, when people are giving their perspective of you as a Christian, let this be the perspective that they offer. Let this be the testimony that they give. Let a man so account of us as of ministers of Christ, as servants and stewards of the mysteries of God. What did Paul tell the Corinthians? How should you be known? Be known as servants. Be known as a people who have care and concern, but not just an empathy toward the needs and the hardships of others, but a heart to step in and serve whatever that need is. You see, it's not just enough to sympathize with the needs that others have in their lives if we are unwilling to do anything to help them rise above them. You remember in James chapter 2, I believe it was, James talked about that very same mentality with regard to this idea of seeing a brother or sister destitute in need of daily food and sympathizing with that need, but in response to that need, just simply saying, "Go thy way, be warmed and filled." Do what? You just saw somebody who didn't have adequate clothing. They're freezing to death. Not only are they freezing to death, but they're hungry. And you as a child of God, you look at them, you see them naked, you see them hungry, you sympathize with their need, but your response is, rise up, be warmed and filled. How are they going to do it? How can they be warmed? How can they be filled? If they had the power to do it of their own accord, it would already be done. And James used that as an example to teach those Christians to whom he wrote to not just sympathize with their need, but to rise up and serve that need, to display the love of Christ and to display the love of His people, and allow that to touch their hearts and perhaps open it to gospel obedience. Then you have Matthew 25. We don't have time this morning, but if you're unfamiliar with verses 34 through 46, turn to it and kind of scan through it as I talk for the next couple of minutes. Matthew 25, 34 through 46, the judgment scene. The separation of the sheep and the goats. And Jesus describes that judgment scene to His disciples. And He talks about those that were placed on the right hand and those that were placed on the left hand. And what was the predominant criteria, the predominant variable that distinguished those on the right from those on the left? It was their service. It was the heart that they had to look to the needs of those around them and not just say, rise up and be warm and filled. In today's language, that would be like us looking at the hardship of someone around us, being capable of filling the need, but just simply saying, well, I'll pray for you. Now, am I knocking the power of prayer? Absolutely not. And I'm not saying the best thing in the world wouldn't be to pray for them, but you know what? What are we going to be praying for? That they be warmed and filled. How is that going to happen? What's going to be the answer to that prayer? I could be the answer to that prayer. You could be the answer to that prayer. It's not just enough sometimes when we see a need that we could feel to just say, well, I'll pray for you. Pray for them, yes, but be the answer to that prayer. Show them the love of God. Serve that need, just as Christ served our needs. But you look at Matthew 25 and you see that judgment scene. Why are those on the right on the right? Why was the master able to look at them and say, come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world? Because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick and in prison, you visited me. And they said, well, Lord, when did we do that? When did we see you hungry and feed you? When did we see you thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you naked or in prison, or sick or in prison, and visit you? And He said, when you did it unto one of these, the least of my brethren, you did it to me. And He turned to those on the left. And He said, depart from me, ye that worketh iniquity. Why? Because when I was hungry, you didn't give me food. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink. When I was naked, you didn't clothe me. When I was sick and in prison, you didn't visit me. You didn't see to my needs. And they said, Lord, when did we see you in those positions and not help? And He said, when you did it not to one of these, the least of my brethren, you didn't do it to me. And He condemned them to outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth forever. What was the predominant variable? It was whether or not they had the heart of a servant. How important is it? It's of eternal importance. And if I'm trying to decide whether I've made Christ my life or not, all I need to do, number one, look, am I willing to suffer? Number two, am I a servant? Tonight we'll finish this discussion by looking at a couple of more criteria. If Christ is my life, it's going to be evident by the fact that I study about Him. And number four, if Christ is my life, it will be evident in the amount of effort I am putting forth in striving to go to be with Him. Come back tonight and we'll finish that discussion. But is Christ your life this morning? Have you dedicated yourself to Him, to serve Him, to love Him, to one day go and be with Him? Maybe you sit there and you honestly examine your life, and right now you have no other capability than coming to the conclusion that the answer is no. You haven't made Christ your life. And if that's the conclusion to which you've come, I'm going to be forthright and honest with you. We love you, and God loves you, and that's something that can be easily corrected right now. But if you don't correct it, if you don't make the decision to make Christ your life, you stand in fear of eternal condemnation. You have no hope. But you can bypass all of that this morning by simply coming and giving your life over to Him and making Him your life. How do you do that? Just by doing what God said. And what He said to do is, if you believe that Jesus is the Son, you're willing to turn from your sin, acknowledge that faith publicly, and be immersed in water to contact Jesus' blood, you can have your sins washed away. But do it today. Maybe you've done that in the past, but you've lost sight of your goal. Christ is no longer your life. You've begun to make other things a priority, but you need to come back. You can do that. As an erring child of God, come back and turn from whatever it is that's separating you from Him. Put it to the side. Put it away. Confess it and seek His forgiveness. And He says when we do that, He forgives us. He welcomes us back unto His own. He's like the Father welcoming the prodigal back. He'll put a ring on our finger, a robe on our back. He'll kill the fatted calf, and He will celebrate that we, His lost child, have come home. And if you need to do that, please come now. While together we stand and sing.
Here's my ear, O Lord, my God. Take me to your door this day. I will serve no other God. Lord, I'm here to stay, for you have paid the price for me. With